you can get an award of attorney fees if you prevail, but if you lose, you don't get any attorney fees. But from my point of view, having been around a long time, it's very important that people have accessibility to the system. Now, I tried most of my cases in federal court. That is somewhat foreign and probably to a lot of people, but most of the violations that we have involving the police are called federal civil rights violations. And you take the federal matters, I'm sure you've had con law of some kind. If you have, you will understand this, that you take those matters to federal court because they flow out of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So they're federal causes of actions. And so I spent a lot of time there, and that's a different place, but that's where I take those cases. Some can be taken in state court, but there are different kinds of actions, and you just have to work through how you want to do it. You mentioned that I wrote this book, and I did write this book 10 years ago now, called Blue versus Black. Let's end the conflict between cops and minorities. And what was important for me, I had finished the Rodney King trial, and I was really taken aback by one of the officers in that case, a young man out of Kansas who was seen beating Rodney King, and I couldn't understand why did a young man like that, who seemed to be a pretty decent young guy, he'd come out to California from Kansas with his wife and 2 kids. There was nothing about it that suggested he was a racist or anything of that nature, so I couldn't understand how that could happen. And so I started to do more of an academic look into this whole thing, and ultimately I wrote about it, and it ultimately became clear to me the culture of a department really can affect a person's perspective on what is the difference between right or wrong. The culture of the department is one of protecting each other. They make excuses, they justify the use of force or the deadly force, and you as part of that unit become more committed to that unit and what it represents than you are really to the rule of law. And it's reflected in what they call a code of silence, the brotherhood, whatever you want to do, but it will cause people to lie, not be truthful. Unfortunately, in dealing with police as much as I have, I'm never surprised at their willingness to lie and to cover up. That's not all police officers. It clearly isn't. But when I'm dealing with them in cases, you know, there is no hesitation to lie. And it has nothing to do with their background. White officers, black officers, women, all are part of the same entity. And my job is to try to kind of hold them on, make them hold them accountable as much as I can. It's a real challenge. But let me just finish up here by talking about some of the big issues that I see facing some of the civil rights issues in the area that I'm working in. Racial profiling is probably one of those kinds of issues that says a lot about where we are, and it is a sort of to me, a damning experience that people have, because what it essentially means is that under the Constitution, a police officer is supposed to have reasonable suspicion or probable cause before they stop you. Whether they stop you on walking, or whether they stop you in driving your car, before they enter your house. Well, if you substitute race for the probable cause or reasonable suspicion, you've essentially said, I'm stopping this person based upon their race, and that's called racial profiling. Now, this has been a nationwide discussion for a number of years. In fact, before Bush versus Gore, when Bush versus Gore were competing for the presidency back in '99, it was a topic of conversation, and one that I have been involved in ever since. Certainly around the country, if you come from other parts of the country, you will know that there have been a lot of discussions around racial profiling on some of the major highways throughout the country, here in California as well. Well, you know, I remind everyone that Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall said, quote, "A negative encounter with the police is a rite of passage for every Negro in America." And I have found that to be true, that everyone, you know, every African-American male of any profession, every profession, has been stopped, and stopped without a basis for stopping. And presently I'm representing a lawyer, a public defender, a well-recognized guy who was stopped for no apparent reason. He had a very nice car. A professor, a retired 75-year-old, 80-year-old, almost 80-year-old professor was stopped because it looked like he had a very nice car. He was pulled out of his car and handcuffed. And the teacher out here that I represent. So my office is inundated with people who are stopped. And if it doesn't happen to you, it's going to happen to your son, or your nephew, or one of them. And I am sort of in the business of trying to minimize that. And the capricious nature of it is this. And African Americans in some communities, for example, in Oakland, are stopped maybe 3.5 times greater than, more likely than any other population. What they found is that the yield from that stop is far less than it is for whites and others who are stopped. Meaning that you stop many more African Americans and you get a lot less from it. That is, arrest or now drugs. You stop fewer whites because you have a basis to stop them, and you get a higher yield factor. You get more drugs and or more arrest. Well, to me, that only illustrates the issues of racial profiling. Now, the data that I just mentioned is pretty common. It's just pretty common in New York City. You know, they have this huge stop and frisk practice that's going on, and the yield factors in those cities are equally disparaging or disparate. Now, what this ultimately means is that when people get stopped by the police, it's pretty shocking to them, and it can create an uneasiness from them. And what happens, some people react to it and they talk themselves into in a way that they can have a bad outcome. Charles Ogletree, the professor at Harvard, wrote this book this past year called Presumed Guilty: The Arrest of Henry Louis Gates and Race, Class, and Crime. I'm certain that all of you remember, or certainly you should remember, the professor at Harvard, Henry Louis Gates, who was stopped and ultimately detained and arrested in his own house, where the question was whether or not there was probable cause for that to occur, particularly when he was entering his own house and tried to tell them that he lived there. But the officer was unwilling to accept that. So I have had numerous cases along these lines, and it is one of these areas that I think that really needs to be worked on consistently. The next area that probably is the most damning of all, and it's what are you going to do in terms of what rights, if any, do ex-cons have, ex-felons